Good evening, everyone, and on behalf of the museum, welcome. Whether you are joining us on the live stream or tuning in at a later date and time, thank you for your support and joining us this evening for another installment of the Museum Plus. My name is Katelynn Dietrich, and I'm the Director of Public Programs and Special Projects at the museum. We begin today by acknowledging that we're meeting on Aboriginal land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet here, and we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. Long before today, there have been Indigenous peoples who have been the stewards of this place. In particular, we acknowledge the Neutral, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. Tonight's event is in support of our latest exhibition, Dinosaurs, the Age of Big, Weird, Feathered Things. Visitors will be allowed to explore the exhibition once we are safely able to be open to the public. However, don't panic, you will have plenty of time to explore this exhibition as it will be open till early fall 2021 here at the museum. I am currently sitting in our exhibition to give everyone a small sneak peek of one of the many feather stories you'll be able to explore at the museum. Behind me is a velociraptor. This exhibition will serve as a great introduction to the modern dinosaur, and because it explores some of the new research on what we now know about dinosaurs. Thank you to the Government of Ontario for funding this exhibition and related programming. Tonight's dialogue will act as a great introduction to the exhibition, and we are fortunate to be joined this evening by Dr. Jordan Mallon, who is a paleontologist at the Canadian Museum of Nature, where Jordan studies dinosaur evolution and paleoecology. He has named a number of new fossil species, including the horned dinosaur, Spiclypeus shipporum. He regularly conducts fieldwork in Alberta and Saskatchewan, but his research has taken him around the world. Tonight, he put together a special presentation for us specific to the research on the recent history of feathered dinosaurs, dinosaur finds, and the surprises that came with them. Afterwards, we will do a Q&A, so if you have any questions throughout the event, please share them in the comments box. So now, please welcome Dr. Jordan Mallon.
Great, thank you, Katelynn, and congrats on pronouncing my dinosaur right, Spiclypeus. You got it dead on. Okay, let me see how to share my screen here. And bear with me a moment because this is never fun to figure out. Okay, are we seeing my screen okay, Katelynn or Claire? Oh, you are. Here, hold on. You shouldn't be. Hold on here. Bear with me. Are you still seeing it? Okay, good. It was working earlier and I did the same thing I thought, and then it didn't work. Anyways, thanks again to Katelynn for the introduction. I guess I don't need to introduce myself again, but very briefly, I'm Jordan Mallon with the Canadian Museum of Nature, and I'm happy to talk tonight about well, I've called my talk Dinosaurs on the Wing. And so I'll be talking about feathered dinosaurs and what we've learned about them in recent years. I'm 38 years young, but more and more as I get older, I find I feel more and more like grumpy Gus here. You know, the little things bother you as you get older and you become grumpy and curmudgeonly, and that's true of my personal life, and that's also true of my professional life. And I thought I'd vent tonight. I'd start off by venting about some of my pet peeves when it comes to being a paleontologist. Number one, being compared to Ross from Friends. Every time I tell people what I do, I always get compared to Ross from Friends. And you know, Ross is probably the worst fictional paleontologist that I know of. He really doesn't know what he's talking about if you watch that show. So yeah, that really gets my goat. Compared to Ross, what else? Oh, when there's a new dinosaur announcement or a new dinosaur find that's made its way to the news. Inevitably, if you make the mistake of scrolling down too low on the news feed, you get to the comment section, which is just full of politics and people comparing, politicians to dinosaurs and vice versa. And it just makes your eyes roll. This happens without fail. And I don't know why I torture myself by reading them, but that also, that really gets my goat. And then I'll finish with this last one here. This always happens every year around Thanksgiving on Facebook. I'm friends with a lot of paleontologists on Facebook. And every time Thanksgiving rolls around, my feed is full of paleontologists going, "Oh, don't forget, people, when you're cutting open your turkey this Thanksgiving, you're actually eating a dinosaur." And that's like all my feed reads for about a week leading up to Thanksgiving. And it just, it gets really annoying. I feel like as paleontologists in the last, 20 years or so, I feel like we've done a pretty good job of getting across the point that birds are dinosaurs, that birds are descended from dinosaurs, because you hear it so often. At least I do anyways. I don't know if anyone else feels the same way. But I think what maybe the public knows less about is why we think that. What is the evidence for that? And I've got my friend here, I don't know what we'll call him, Confused Stanley. Confused Stanley's wanting to know a bit more about, what's the evidence for birds having been descended from dinosaurs. We're going to see Confused Stanley a lot more tonight. But I want to talk about sort of the recent state of the conversation as far as dinosaur-bird relationships are concerned. And so I'm going to be really talking about the 1990s forwards. But all that is to say, the conversation about dinosaurs and birds being related goes back to the 1880s with this man. Hopefully you can see my cursor on the right here. That's a man by the last name of Huxley, known as Darwin's bulldog. And Huxley argued that dinosaurs and birds were related. He noted many commonalities between them. And so a lot of the early discussions focused on, what would an early bird look like if they're related to reptiles or dinosaurs of some kind. So you can see some pictures here that feature some of those early ideas. And then on the bottom left-hand side there, we have John Ostrom. This man was really important in the 60s and 70s for pushing forward the idea that birds are descended from dinosaurs. He found some pretty significant fossil finds to that end too. So all that is to say, there's a long history of thought about dinosaur-bird relationships. But I want to start with sort of the state of where we are now. And the state of where we are in that conversation now really goes back to China and the finds that have been coming out of there recently. And specifically in northeastern China, in Liaoning province, which you can see highlighted in red there, and the surrounding provinces in the northeast as well. If you go to Liaoning, you'll see a lot of shale outcrops where this Chinese farmer is standing here. He's holding up a piece of shale with some fossils in it. And these shales were deposited in ancient lake environments and contain a lot of volcanic ash. Volcanic ash is very fine particulate matter. And so when you deposit fossils in environments like this, you're going to get really amazing fossils. And so our conversation today starts in Liaoning province and focuses on the really fascinating feathered dinosaurs that have been coming out of there since the 90s. So I thought, first of all, I'd sort of introduce everyone to this animal called Sinosauropteryx. Sinosauropteryx is a small, what we call a theropod dinosaur, a small meat-eating dinosaur. This fellow is about the size of a cat or so, lived about 124 million years ago. And Sinosauropteryx was the first feathered dinosaur we had found. That is to say, the first non-bird dinosaur, if we're thinking of birds as dinosaurs. So it was discovered in 1996 and announced that same year. And if you look along its back here, you can see this very sort of fine row of black, almost, furry looking outline. We might call these proto-feathers. They're actually very simple hair-like structures. They're not, complex as a feather is today, but nevertheless, they're not scales either. So this was really the first piece of evidence that we could say, aha, we've got feathered dinosaurs, or something like feathers. And then after that, that was 1996. After that, there was just an explosion of feathered dinosaurs coming out of China, because the farmers there knew to look for them. And also because, researchers, paleontologists got their ears up and started paying attention to what's coming out of Liaoning province. And so you get new feathered dinosaurs, coming out of the woodworks, things like Jinfengopteryx, Caudipteryx, Zhenyuan Long. And actually National Geographic did a special on a number of these dinosaurs, a special issue in 1998. So this was sort of right at the blossoming of these finds as they were coming out of China. So we've got hundreds of examples of these things now, and they've taught us a lot. And one thing I'm going to be talking about in this talk is, what are we learning about these feathered dinosaurs? But first, I thought I'd sort of introduce you to some of my favorites. Not all of these things are birds, or not all of these things look just like birds. They're almost like birds with a twist. So despite the fact that they've got, wings and feathers, my friend here, Microraptor, which is a small cat-sized dinosaur, actually is sort of famous for having wings on its legs, not just on its arms, but on its legs too. And you can see in the reconstruction here, you've got wings coming off the lower legs. And it was thought that probably what's going on here is this animal, it's hard to imagine this animal flapping its legs as it would its arm wings, but probably it was using its legs as some kind of rudder to help steer itself through the air, or to give itself lift as it was gliding through the air. And in that sense, it was acting very much as a biplane does today, with two sets of wings. And hopefully you can see them in these fossils here. I've got a red arrow pointing to the wings on the legs. So that's Microraptor, a really cool fossil. Another one that's pretty neat is Eutyrannus, which means feathered tyrant. This lived about 125 million years ago, again from Liaoning. A big animal, it's, a half a ton. And it's, as the name implies, it's actually a tyrannosaur. So we're talking about quite a large and feathered tyrannosaur. It's kind of hard to see. The feather is probably on your screens. But if you look in the lower right here, this is part of the tail. There's some little kind of hair-like structures coming off the back there, and I've just kind of scribbled them in red there to give you an idea for how they're coming off there. But this is one of the tyrannosaurs, not T-Rex, but a cousin of T-Rex, and it's feathered. We often think of feathered dinosaurs as being small, but this animal again is 600 kilograms, and yet it's covered in feathers. Really cool animal. Yiqi is another one. Yiqi's probably one of my favorites. Late Jurassic, almost 160 million years ago. It's about the size of a blue jay. So this is another small feathered dinosaur. You can see its fossil on the left here. The fossil's covered in feathers, but one of the really interesting things about this fossil is, while it does have wings, those wings are not made up of feathers like birds typically are. In fact, there's a skin membrane that stretches between its elongate fingers. And so it's experimenting with flight. And that seems to be a lesson we're learning from a lot of these early feathered dinosaurs is when they radiate, they start to experiment with flight in different ways. We get biplanes, we get these Yi Chis flying around with a skin membrane between its fingers. And it looks for all the world almost like a dinosaurian bat. Bats do the same thing, right? They've got skin stretched between the fingers here. So Yi Chi is really cool in that respect. And of course, we're broadcasting from Canada, and Confused Stanley is asking himself, well, what about Canadian dinosaurs? You know, I hear that there's lots of dinosaurs to be found in Alberta and in Saskatchewan. Do we not have any feathered dinosaurs there? Generally speaking, we don't. That's not to say that there weren't feathered dinosaurs there. They were almost certainly feathered, but we don't have the same types of sediments and sedimentary environments in Canada as we do in China. And so we just don't preserve feathers as well. Having said that, there are some examples, some exciting examples. One is Ornithomimus, which is one of these ostrich mimic or bird mimic dinosaurs. This animal is about the size of an ostrich, and it lived in Alberta about 72 million years ago. And we've known about them for 100 years only from their bones, but recently there were some discoveries made of, you can kind of see in the bottom of the slide here, this animal has these very fine feather-like structures running along the back. And, you know, chances are we've seen this for the last 100 years and didn't think much of it because we just didn't have the right search image. When preparators would have seen this as they were preparing the fossils, they wouldn't have realized that those were feathers because they just didn't have that search image. But, you know, having seen all these feathered dinosaurs out of China now, we've been paying a little closer attention. And lo and behold, we are finding two examples now, I think it is, of feathered ornithomimosaurs, these ostrich mimic dinosaurs here in Alberta. So that's really cool. And actually, we've learned from Ornithomimus that it doesn't just have feathers, but they actually have full-on wings, which you can see in the depiction here. And as I say, Ornithomimus is the size of an ostrich, so it's probably not flying with those wings. It's probably using the wings for something else, and I'll get to that idea a little later in the talk. Oh, I have that map there. That star just shows where it was found in near Drumheller, Alberta. But if we go not too far away in Grassy Lake, Alberta, we can find amber. That's fossilized tree sap that dates from the age of the dinosaurs. And recently in that amber, we have been finding feathers, sort of primitive looking feathers. They don't look like modern bird feathers. They're a little more primitive looking, and yet they are branching structures. So you remember when I talked about Sinosauropteryx, its feathers almost looked like simple hairs, but these feathers that we find in the amber in Grassy Lake are actually branching. They're a little more complex. So chances are they are from dinosaurs. And so we actually have dinosaur feathers preserved in amber in Alberta, and it's sort of the first of its kind ever found. A really, really neat fossil. And, you know, I'm very curious to see what develops from this amber material in the next, you know, who knows, 10 or 20 years. Really amazing fossils being found out in Alberta. All the dinosaurs I've talked about so far have been more or less meat-eating dinosaurs. Maybe there's some omnivores in there. But of course, I haven't talked about long-necked sauropod dinosaurs or things like Triceratops or Stegosaurus or any of the plant-eating dinosaurs. And so our friend Confused Stanley wants to know about them. By and large, Stanley, we do find scales on a lot of these dinosaurs. A lot of the horned dinosaurs have scales. A lot of the sauropods have scales. A lot of the duck-billed dinosaurs are scaled. But there are some examples of tantalizing feather-like structures on some of the plant eaters. So this is Psittacosaurus here. It's an early relative of Triceratops. It dates quite a bit older than Triceratops, in fact, to the early Cretaceous period, about 125 million years ago. This animal we know mainly from China, again, Liaoning. And there was a fossil of Psittacosaurus found recently that's got feathers running along the tail. So here's the tail running from front to back if you're following my cursor here. And you'll see all along the top of the tail, you've got these almost bristle-like structures. I don't want to call them feathers, but they're very hair-like. They almost look like the bristles off of the back of a porcupine or something like that. And so you can see Psittacosaurus reconstructed up top here as having these bristle-like displays. We wouldn't have guessed that from the bones alone. It takes this spectacular preservation to show us that this was the case for this particular animal. You might have seen this fossil in the news recently because in addition to having these bristles on its tail, it also preserves the first known dinosaur cloaca, the non-scientific term we might call a butthole. And this was in CBC News this week. So there's a study that came out about that. So we're learning all kinds of things from this one fossil, whether you like it or not. Another really interesting find of a little plant eater. This is Katelynn found recently in Siberia. It dates to the late Jurassic. So when things like, Stegosaurus and Allosaurus and, Brachiosaurus and Brontosaurus, when those guys were running around, little Katelynn was living up in Siberia. And what's neat about Katelynn is, well, first of all, it's one of these fossils that, again, occurs outside of China. So we do find feathered dinosaurs outside of China. They just occur less frequently. But this is one found in Russia. And what's neat is it's got a sort of a mix of feathers and scales preserved across the body. We've got many specimens of this animal. And you see this combination of feathers and scales preserved along the body. And interestingly, some of these, I use the term feathers loosely here. Maybe I think the authors of this research called them filaments, but what's neat is these filaments kind of branch off. There's my cursor here in the lower right. Branch off what for all the world look like scales. They're called basal plates in the scientific paper, but you get these almost, again, bristly or filamentous structures coming off those scales that for all the world look kind of feathery. And so, we get feathers and feather-like things in the meat eaters, and we get them, in the plant eaters as well. So the story is getting more and more complex, but also more and more interesting, I would say. What are we calling this guy? Confused Samuel or whatever? He wants to know what if the feathers aren't preserved? Stanley, his name just came to me. What if the feathers aren't preserved? Is there any way of knowing if a dinosaur had feathers or not if you don't have that type of preservation? And the answer is yes, but we have to infer it in a less direct route, obviously. So one way is looking at quill nodes on bones. And so this is if you look at C and D here, where my cursor is at the bottom of the screen, this is the forearm of a bird. This is I lost my slide here. The forearm of a bird, forearm bone here is what you're looking at, the ulna. And what you can see is where the feathers of the arm attach, those primary feathers, they actually leave a scar on the bone. And these scars are called quill nodes. So the feather's actually effectively touching the bone. I don't want to say embedded in the bone, but it's very closely associated with the bone. And it leaves these kind of scars along the forearm. Well, as it turns out, you can see very similar quill nodes. They're kind of hard to see here, but there's arrows there to help your eye. You can see these same quill nodes in Velociraptor. So we've never found a feathered Velociraptor, but we have found these quill nodes in the forearms of Velociraptor, which strongly suggests that Velociraptor, of Jurassic Park fame, was in fact feathered. And this is sort of the evidence that we have to show that. A little less direct would be brooding behavior. So we have several fossils now showing dinosaurs brooding their nests, sitting on top of their nests to keep the eggs warm. And this here on the left is Oviraptor. This is an animal from Mongolia. And it's reconstructed on the right here, featherless, and it's reconstructed having sort of big wings, feathers on the wings. And you can tell just by looking at it how much better it's able to incubate its eggs if it were to have wings as opposed to a naked scaly body. Often scaly animals today don't brood their eggs. They tend not to sit on them. They tend to bury them or something like that. And often birds, which do brood their eggs, very often anyways, will sit on top of their eggs. And so it just makes sense in that regards that Oviraptor would have feathers as well. And actually, we know that some of Oviraptor's relatives, like Caudipteryx that I mentioned earlier, had feathers as well. So it's not such a stretch. You can see kind of the eggs poking out of the nest here. An amazing fossil out of Mongolia. There's Stanley again, and he wants to know how feathers evolved. So we've kind of talked a little bit about what they're good for and where we find them, but Stanley would like to know how they evolved. So feather evolution is a complicated subject, but it's kind of simplified in this diagram here. So currently we think feathers evolved in multiple stages. So in the most primitive stage to the left here, you get some sort of hair-like or filament-like structure. And from that, you can develop that into a number of different, more complex structures. For example, here you can have multiple filaments stemming from the same base, from the same node, so to speak. And you get basically what we would call down. This is basically a downy feather. And so we think this is sort of an early stage of feather evolution. And you can also evolve that structure, or the more basal structure, into a very complex branching structure. So you can develop this single, we'll call it a root, into what we would call a rachis, which forms sort of the central vein of a feather. And then off that central vein, off that rachis, you get these barbs. And then off those barbs, you get these barbules, and they tend to sort of interlock with one another in flight feathers to give the feather some structure. And as it turns out, we see this entire sequence preserved within dinosaurs. So I want to show that on my diagram here. This is a nasty thing us paleontologists call a cladogram. So I just want to, it's not necessarily self-explanatory, so I just want to explain it first. This is basically just a family tree of dinosaurs and their nearest relatives, like the pterosaurs here, the flying reptiles. Pterosaurs are not dinosaurs. Notice that they occur outside this blue triangle here. So everything within the blue triangle is a dinosaur. We got the theropod dinosaurs, including the birds. We get the sauropod, the long-necked sauropod dinosaurs, and we get the plant-eating ornithischian dinosaurs. Think of things like, Stegosaurus and Triceratops and Ankylosaurus, and a lot of our childhood favorites. Well, how are feathers distributed across this family tree? Well, it turns out we see a mosaic of feather types among dinosaurs. So if we look at the theropod branch here, we get scales. We find examples of theropods with scales preserved, and we find these very simple sort of filamentous or hair-like structures We get these more downy feathers among the theropods too, and we get the very complex barbed, what we might consider true feathers. And of course, we certainly see those in the birds, obviously. The long-necked sauropod dinosaur branch. So far, we haven't found anything feather-like in those guys yet. All the sauropod, integument or skin that we know about is scaly. And so we're pretty confident that sauropods didn't have feathers at this point. And then, of course, the ornithischians, I mentioned a couple examples of these plant eaters having these very simple hair-like structures and these almost, down-like feathers. Again, I use that term loosely. And of course, I mentioned that we've got lots of plant eaters too, these ornithischians with scales. So, what common factor do we see among all these groups? Well, it's hard not to notice that most of them, well, in fact, all of them have scales. At least each group contains some examples that have scales, and the sauropods don't have feathers of any kind. So we might therefore be tempted to think that the earliest dinosaurs, that common ancestor of the dinosaurs, the very first dinosaur, had scales. It was scaly too. And I think that would be a warranted conclusion. Well, wait a minute, look at those. Look at the cousins to the dinosaurs up here, the pterosaurs. What about them? What's going on with them? Well, recently we've found some pterosaurs in China that have very hair-like or feather-like structures. We've often known that pterosaurs could be a little bit fuzzy, but there's a group called the agneronathids. They're the frog-mouthed pterosaurs. And we've been finding some agneronathids in China that have these sort of almost downy-like feathers. And we wouldn't necessarily have predicted this. So, and actually this is being a little bit debated right now, but the fossils can kind of speak for themselves here. You see all these hair-like structures that unite at a common node at the base. And that's something we only otherwise see in birds and dinosaurs. So if we go back to our cladogram here, again, we note that we see these, for lack of a better term, these this downy type feather and this hair-like feather in the pterosaurs. And they might have had some scales too. In fact, they probably did. But if the cousins of dinosaurs had feathers, and if a lot of the descendants of dinosaurs have feathers, well, then maybe there's also some reason for thinking that the first dinosaur didn't have scales, but was in fact feathered itself, at least in some kind of way. So that's actually kind of a debate that's going on among paleontologists right now, is whether or not the first dinosaurs were scaly or feathered or a mix of both. It's a very interesting conversation to follow. Another thing paleontologists like to talk about is about the evolution of flight. So never mind feathers. How did flight evolve? We know that birds can fly today. Certainly the majority of them do. And so how did that come to be? And historically, there have been two hypotheses, two ideas about how you evolve, bird flight from a dinosaur. And these two competing hypotheses are illustrated on my screen here. So on the left, we've got what we call the ground up hypothesis. So we've got a dinosaurian ancestor. It's running about on the ground. Maybe it's chasing its, insects or something like that. And it slowly evolves feathers, and some of those feathers may be given an advantage, maybe for reaching out and catching insects, or maybe to provide a bit of lift so it can scurry along the ground better. And over time, over millions of years, you developed a fully winged animal. But that evolved from a terrestrial, a ground living dinosaur. On the other hand, we have what's called the trees down hypothesis, where we have dinosaurs actually living in the trees, and they're evolving flight from the trees down. Maybe they're gliding downwards. And of course, you don't need a giant wing to glide, but certainly it helps. And the bigger the wing you have, the more lift you'll get. And if you start flapping those wings, well, eventually you might develop something like powered flight. And so that's the trees down hypothesis. And paleontologists have been debating these two hypotheses for years now. And for a long time, we didn't really have much evidence for the trees down hypothesis. Most of the most bird-like dinosaurs we had were fairly big. They were sort of human size. Look at Deinonychus in the upper left-hand corner there, and Oviraptor off to the right here. We talked about Oviraptor already. These animals were about the size of a human, and it's hard to envision them. It's hard to envision them flying. And so we thought, well, maybe this ground-up hypothesis has some merit if the most bird-like dinosaurs we know about are actually quite big and probably didn't fly. But again, I hearken back to these new fossil finds out of China, where we get a lot of small cat-sized and bird-sized dinosaurs that have wings, and for all the world, they look like they were probably living in the trees. A lot of the sediments, or the sedimentary environments, I should say, where we find these dinosaurs were probably quite heavily forested. And so it makes sense to think that a lot of these small dinosaurs were living up in the trees, like Microraptor here and Anchiornis in the bottom right. I'll be talking about some more of these guys again later. And so right now, I'd say there's a little more evidence for the trees down hypothesis than for the ground up hypothesis. But the story is a bit more complicated than that. I'm kind of simplifying things for the audience. And we'll actually get back to this idea again momentarily. Our confused friend here, Stanley, wants to know, what good is half a feather? You know, if you're evolving feathers through this series of steps where you've got a hair-like structure and then maybe a downy-like structure and then a more complex barb structure, well, you know, we know that that complex structure is really good for flying, but what good is half a feather? You know, how do you evolve half a feather? In order for something to evolve adaptively, it has to have some purpose, some adaptive use. And so the question that Stanley wants to know here is, well, what is the adaptive use of half a feather, you know? And we don't really have to think hard about that question to have some idea. We just need to look at birds today. So number one, beyond flight, feathers are really good for insulation. And this is a common sight I'm sure we all see here in Canada. A blue jay sort of fluffing up its feather to get as much air in amongst the feathers as possible. And that those feathers trap the air and provide some insulation for it. So great, feathers are great for insulation, whether they be complex or more simple, like a downy feather. Brooding too, I mentioned brooding earlier in reference to Oviraptor. Feathers can help cover the nest. They can help keep the chicks warm. They can help protect the eggs from the environment. So feathers are great that way. They're great for display. I've got an example of an ostrich here. Male ostriches often display to one another and to females using their big feathery wings in order to maybe show off to rivals. They'll even chase away would-be predators that way in a sort of a threat display. So ostriches don't fly, and yet they still make use of those wings. So feathers serve all kinds of different purposes. And I want to mention this too. This is a sort of a neat purpose for feathers that we only realized recently. This is something called wing-assisted incline running. So what you're looking at here is a chukar pheasant. And you can notice that it's using its wings to basically push itself or almost pull itself up this beam here. This is a phenomenon that was only noticed in the last 20 years or so by a man by the name of Ken Dial in his lab. And he's been studying this wing-assisted incline running. What he's found is birds can use their wings not to fly per se, but they can use it to provide they can use their wings to sort of push their bodies, thrust their bodies up against a surface, and they actually use their hind limbs to run up that surface. So they're not flying up this beam here. The pheasant's actually walking up the beam, and it's using its wings to help it get traction. And they can do this with, if you clip their feathers, if you clip their wings, they can do this, albeit on less inclined surfaces. But the bigger the wing surface they have, the steeper the incline they can run up. And that's really cool because that suggests an adaptive purpose for even half a wing in some of these early dinosaurs. So we might envision some of these early dinosaurs practicing a very similar behavior, maybe in order to escape a predator and scurry up a tree. And so in that sense, this wear or wing-assisted incline running sort of spans the gap between the ground up hypothesis and the trees down hypothesis. Maybe these animals are running from the ground up into a tree to escape, and then they're evolving flight on their way back down. So because they've already got that flapping motion mastered. So it's a really complex subject right now, and there's been a lot of really interesting research coming out of this question about the evolution of flight in birds. So keep an eye on that. And lastly, a little further to go, what color were they? What color are dinosaurs? I get this question all the time, whether it's in reference to feathered dinosaurs or not. How do we know what color the dinosaurs we were? Well, when I was a kid, and when I read, the textbooks when I was a kid, you would always read, that color doesn't preserve, and we'll never know what color dinosaurs were. So stop asking. We just got to guess, right? It's just guesswork. That's not true anymore. It still blows my mind thinking about that we're actually starting to learn something about the outside of dinosaurs. What, not just, what did their bone structure look like, but what color were they? How do you preserve color in a dinosaur? Well, I'm going to walk us through that. This refers specifically to the feathered dinosaurs. If you look at birds today, if you look at their feathers under a microscope, you can see what are called melanosomes. Melanosomes are organelles. They're little components of a cell that produce pigment. That is pigment that gives feathers their color. And it turns out that if you look at those little melanosomes in modern bird feathers, their shape, the shapes of the melanosomes correspond to the color of pigment that they produce. So you get rod-shaped melanosomes, you might get more spherical shaped melanosomes, or sort of very flattened melanosomes. And those different shapes correspond to different colors in the feather. So by studying the shapes, you can learn something about the color of that feather. It's a little bit more complicated than that. There are some colors that don't correspond to melanosomes, but generally speaking, this holds true. Well, it turns out that if you look at some of these feathered dinosaurs, especially out of China, under the microscope, a high-powered, scanning electron microscope like I'm showing on the left here, you can see those melanosomes if you zoom in close enough. And remember what I said, if you know the shape of the melanosome, you can know something about the color that it produced. And so we can actually, in this way, infer the colors of some of these feathered dinosaurs. And so here's some of our feathered friends here, reconstructed with the colors that we've learned about from the fossil record. So Anchiornis, which is a little troodontid, we know had sort of a red head crest. Really cool. Microraptor looked a little bit like a crow. It was sort of an iridescent black color. We talked about Microraptor earlier when we were talking about the biplane dinosaur. And Kai Hong here, we think probably had, again, sort of an iridescent, almost sort of a rainbow colored head and neck and back. So, you know, we don't have hundreds of examples of these color determinations yet, but we do have a handful now. And in that way, we're learning that, you know, dinosaurs were colorful. They were using their feathers probably for display of some kind, having all those colors. Maybe they were for threatening predators. Maybe they were for displaying to mates or something like that. But just, you know, mind-blowing stuff. And I think this is probably some of the most interesting research to come out of the study of these feathered dinosaurs in recent years. And I'm talking maybe about the last 5 years or so. Anyways, hopefully you've been enlightened. Hopefully our friend Stanley here is no longer confused. Hopefully he's feeling enlightened as well. And with that, I'll finish the talk and I'll open the floor up to questions if we have time. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jordan. That was great. So I've been keeping track of questions, and a lot of the viewers have been engaged and been answering some of the questions as well. So I'm going to read a few and then we can go from there. But
maybe before you start, Katelynn.
Yeah, for sure.
I should say I'm a dinosaur paleontologist, but I don't study feathered dinosaurs. I, as you mentioned at the outset, I mostly work on the non-feathered, you know, big plant-eating dinosaurs. So I can hardly consider myself an expert in this respect, but I also imagine I know more than the average Joe. So let's hear them.
Perfect. Well, we have some viewers of different age demographics. So we have Grant, who's 5 years old, and he wanted to know which dinosaurs lived near Kitchener, Ontario. So if you don't know if there's dinosaurs that live near our region, are there any dinosaurs that have been found in Ontario that you're aware of?
Yeah, sadly, the answer to both questions is no. That's not to say that dinosaurs never lived in Ontario. In fact, they almost certainly did. But most of the rocks that we find in Ontario predate the dinosaurs. You know, the Canadian Shield, for example, predates the dinosaurs by hundreds of millions and billions of years. And so we just don't have any rocks exposed at the surface in Ontario that could even possibly contain dinosaurs. We get a lot of older rocks here. The glaciers very likely removed a lot of the dinosaur-bearing rocks. And so sadly, we don't find them in Ontario. We don't find them in Quebec. There are pockets of dinosaur-aged rocks, like, for example, in Northern Ontario, but they're very hard to get to. As far as we know, they don't contain dinosaurs. You know, we'll keep looking, but sad to say there's nothing yet either near Kitchener or in Ontario. And, you know, I'm from and live in Ontario too, and so it upsets me just as much.
Another question we have is, do you have any tips for young aspiring paleontologists?
Yeah, sure. Obviously stay in school. And I often get asked, like, what do I need to study to become a paleontologist? And it used to be that if you wanted to be a paleontologist, you'd study geology and you'd study biology, because really paleontology is kind of a combination of the two. Geology being the study of rocks, biology being the study of animal life. You know, dinosaurs we know from fossils, so you need to know a little bit about both in order to understand them. Having said that, paleontology is increasingly becoming a more varied field in that we're pulling from all different areas of science now. That includes things like math and statistics and chemistry and genetics and biochemistry and all these different facets. And so I don't think I don't think students today are quite as limited. You know, they don't have to canalize themselves in the same way in order to become a paleontologist. We can use all the help we can get in paleontology, and we take all comers because they can apply what, you know, their own backgrounds to the question of dinosaur science. So that's another thing I might recommend is when you're studying in school, try and get a broad background in the sciences because it's all applicable to paleontology.
Very cool. Just a follow-up question that someone asked was, what job options are there for a paleontologist?
Yeah, see, that's the bad news. What job options are they? Well, you know, I'll be frank, there just aren't very many. It's a small field, and there's not a there's hardly a market for paleontologists right now. It's very competitive for paleontology jobs. Paleontologists, like myself, often work in museums. They also tend to be professors at university. And so you might go that way, becoming a professor at a university and doing some research with your lab, with your students. Having said that, you know, I'm just talking about research paleontologists. You can get into paleontology in other ways too. So for example, preparators, the people who actually sit down and dig the fossils out once you get them back in the lab, dig them out of the rock. You don't need a PhD to be a preparator. And so that's another inroad. You know, I know a lot of my friends are artists, and they're paleo artists. You've seen a lot of their work in this presentation. And so they get paid effectively to illustrate dinosaurs. You know, that's a really competitive field too, don't get me wrong. But all that to say, there's sort of different inroads into the world of dinosaurs and paleontology. And you don't need to follow the way I went, so to speak.
I think getting back to the subject matter of the talk, so one question we got was, would these similarities between different types of dinosaurs be due to completely chance mutations in evolution, or is it possible that there was crossbreeding between similar species?
Crossbreeding between species. Well, we certainly see, we call that crossbreeding, we call that hybridization. And we do see that all the time among animals today, hybrids. But typically when we see hybrids, we see very closely related animals or what produce hybrids, right? You know, think of, you know, gulls often hybridize with one another, or wolves and dogs will hybridize with one another. And it's not very often where you get two completely different species hooking up together to create something brand new in that way. So I wouldn't guess that hybridization was a significant source of novelty, let's say, in these dinosaurs. I suspect a lot, it was more sort of adaptive evolution that way within populations. And I'll leave it there.
Another question we had is there any evidence of feathers in the Tyrannosaurus rex? I've heard theories that say T-Rex had feather-like quills. Is this true?
The answer is we don't know for sure. There are some examples of Tyrannosaurus skin, of T-Rex skin. They're very far and few and far between, you know, little patches of skin that would fit in the palm of your hand. And as far as we know, not just T-Rex skin, but other Tyrannosaurus skin too, especially in North America, by and large looks to be scaly. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean the whole animal was scaly? Well, I showed you the example of Katelynn from Russia earlier, from Siberia, and it had a mix of kind of feather-like things and scales. And so it could be that T-Rex had a similar mix of feathers and scales, and we've only found the scales so far. So we haven't found any positive evidence that Tyrannosaurus rex itself had feathers, but it wouldn't surprise me. And as I said, we know some Tyrannosaurs, some T-Rex ancestors had feathers, Eutyrannus that I mentioned earlier. So the jury's out on that one, I would say.
So we're going to do 2 more questions. The first question is from Penelope. Did any dinosaurs hibernate?
Did any dinosaurs? Well, wouldn't I like to know that? We don't know. We just don't know. Wouldn't surprise me. Some dinosaurs, we do have dinosaur fossils from places like, Alaska and Antarctica, so the Arctic and the Antarctic, and it wasn't as cold during the age of the dinosaurs up there as it is now, but they probably did see snow on occasion, and maybe they hibernated for short periods. We really don't know. A lot of animals that hibernate in holes underground, and I will say that we don't know really of any. I shouldn't say that. We know of very few burrowing dinosaurs. Dinosaurs generally weren't adapted for burrowing, it seems, although we do have one example out of Montana, I think it is, Eryctodromius. And it was a burrowing dinosaur, and maybe it hibernated too. I don't know. So we really don't know. That type of behavior doesn't preserve very well, but it wouldn't surprise me.
And I think this is a great last question. What is the highlight of your career so far?
Oh boy, the highlight of my career. I could give a whole other talk on that, I guess. The highlight of my career, well, you mentioned the horned dinosaur I got to name a few years ago now. Oh boy, it's 5 years ago now, 2021. Spiclypeus. That was really cool. Everybody wants to name a new species. I've been lucky. I've been able to name new species of turtles and marine reptiles, and I got to name a new dinosaur, and there's more coming too, I'll mention. So that was cool. Dug up the skull of a horned dinosaur in Alberta recently, and we airlifted it with a helicopter, which was really cool. So I'll tell you, this COVID stuff was a low point of my career. I do miss getting out to the field. Not able to do that obviously the way I used to, but there have been plenty of high points too, and it keeps me happy.
Thank you once again, Jordan. This has been such an informative presentation, and I think everyone agrees that they probably have learned something new about feathered dinosaurs. So thank you again for joining us this evening.
It was my pleasure, and I'm happy to do it. Thanks for having me, Katelynn.
To conclude the evening, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, Dinosaurs, the Age of Big Weird Feather Things, as well as Sonica, the Sound Experience, will open to the public once museum is safely able to. To stay up to date on all things the museum, such as reopening announcements, exhibition news, and upcoming programming dates, please consider signing up for our newsletter or following us on social media. We will have another dinosaur dialogue next month on Wednesday, March 3rd at 7 p.m. We'll be joined by David C. Evans, Temerty Chair in Vertebrate Paleontology and Vice President of Natural History from the ROM. As well, we are excited to announce that we'll be joined on Thursday, March 18th at 7 p.m. by Dustin Growick. He's also known as the Dinosaur Whisperer on Instagram, for a fun-filled, adults-only dinosaur trivia event. We'll be announcing ticket details soon, so please check out themuseum.ca for more details. And also a special thank you to my colleague Claire for handling the tech tonight. So thank you again for joining us, everyone. Thank you, Jordan, and have a great night.
Thank you.